Since the first primitive tool, human invention has changed the way we live and determined the kind of work we do. Industry born of innovation is designed to improve our lives, but sometimes it leads to tragedy and heartbreak. When Germany's largest factory and the village it employs are reduced to ruin in a matter of a few explosive seconds. And a valley in Belgium is overcome by a lethal combination of weather and industrial waste. Wednesday, September 21st, 1921. The morning fog has yet to clear on this crisp fall day in southwest Germany. In the community of Oppau, 90 kilometers south of Frankfurt, residents prepare for another day. On the village outskirts is the giant fertilizer plant owned by Badische Aniline Soda Fabrik, or BASF. Built 8 years earlier, it is Europe's largest chemical plant, producing nitrates for the manufacture of synthetic fertilizer.
Und als Standort für diese neue Fabrik hat man sich eben
As a location for this new factory, they chose an area which lay on the edge of the town of Oppau.
Oppau lag.
Oppau had never been a very lucky place, as it's situated right beside the Rhine in a boggy plain, so it wasn't a wealthy village. So when the BASF decided to build its ammonia plant, that was the big chance for wealth. Lots of people got work, first in building, later on in the factory.
One of those factory workers is 38-year-old Hermann Humpe. Hermann has been working with BASF as an explosives expert for 15 years. He lives with his wife and 8 children in one of Oppau's more prestigious neighborhoods.
Da haben sie ja diese Doppelhaushälfte bewohnt.
They lived on Soda Street on the property of the BASF, and these houses and residential units were only intended for BASF employees who were very highly regarded.
Angesehene Mitarbeiter haben sie dort.
They raised their 8 children here, and they were a happy family.
Angeblich eine glückliche Familie.
On a farm outside of Oppau, 16-year-old Will Portuna says goodbye to his father Heinrich. Today he starts a new job at the BASF plant, and he has purchased a brand new pair of shoes to make a good impression. "7 a.m. As the night shift prepares to head home, thousands of workers from Oppau and neighboring villages arrive for the start of the day shift. Among them are Hermann Humpe and Will Portuna. At the end of his shift, 41-year-old August Dahmen is ready for the short bicycle ride to his home in the community of Ludwigshafen. As factory foreman on the night shift, August talks with his day shift counterpart before heading out.
They usually discuss everything that happened on the shift and what to look out for. And this sometimes takes longer and is sometimes shorter. On this morning, he and his colleague didn't have much to talk about, so he was able to leave earlier than he normally would.
By 1921, there are more than 20,000 people working for BASF. Different types of fertilizer are produced at the plant, all with an ammonium base. The demand for fertilizer, however, is a seasonal one, restricted to spring and fall, requiring BASF to store huge stockpiles in giant silos, each one able to hold up to 50,000 tons.
And this led to one of the major problems with the fertilizers, because once you've built up a pile of 25 meters of fertilizer, it starts to compact. Just as snow compacts and forms a glacier, it ends up with a very, very hard salt, almost like rock, at the base of the pile. Breaking up this salt rock was very tedious, and to do this by hand with pickaxes and shovels would have taken a long time. and so they resorted to using explosives.
Diese Lockerungssprengungen mit Trägersprengungen gemacht, also Lockerungen. Das war
The loosening blast consisted of a small muffled explosion, like a puff.
Dann sind das diese Dinge mittels
And then these fertilizer salts were broken up into 20, 30, or 40 centimeter chunks.
20 Zentimeter sind die auseinandergebrochen. Und
These cubes were ground up and then put into sacks, and they were sold.
sind dann gemahlen worden, damit sie rieselfähig wurden, und so wurden sie abgesackt und in den Verkauf gebracht.
The task falls to experts trained in handling safety explosives, which is why Herman Humpe and his team are working in silo number 110 just before 7:30 on this September 21st morning.
Man spricht von etwa 20.000.
They say they had set off explosions like these close to 20,000 times with absolutely no problems. They believed that this method was completely safe.
As far as Herman Humpe is concerned, it has always been safe. Today is just another day, just another job. He cannot know, however, that something in this silo has changed, and that this change is about to turn an ordinary day into something very different. Wednesday, September 21st, 1921, 7:30 a.m. Near the village of Oppau, Germany, some 90 kilometers south of Frankfurt, mother-to-be Katharina Henrich is hard at work, despite being 9 months pregnant.
Das heißt, meine Eltern, bei meinen Großeltern.
My parents lived at that time with my grandparents in a farmhouse in Mannheim-Käfertal.
Der Großvater war gerade im Stall mit dem Füttern.
At the time, my grandfather was in the stable, occupied with feeding the animals, and my mother was almost ready to give birth to me, but was not yet having contractions.
Aber war noch nicht in den Wehen.
On another family farm, Heinrich Fortuna tends to his chores after seeing his 16-year-old son Will off to his new job at the fertilizer plant, owned by German corporate giant Badische Aniline Soda Fabrik, or BASF. In Ludwigshafen, Anna Dahmen looks after her 5-month-old daughter Anna Marie, while waiting for her husband August to return home from his night shift at the nitrate plant. Across the river in Oppau, 36-year-old Maria Humpe has just sent 3 of her children off to school, with 5 more still at home to look after. At the Oppau plant, a train pulls in loaded with workers for the day shift. It is 7:32 a.m. Inside storage silo number 110, explosives expert Herman Humpe and his team are about to loosen 4,000 tons of tightly packed fertilizer for bagging and shipping.
Sicherlich auch
Certainly in this occupation, a great deal of attention was paid to safety, and he also had a good reputation.
Just as he has done thousands of times before, Herman oversees the placement of the dynamite. But Herman and his team aren't aware that the chemical composition of the fertilizer has slowly changed over time into something very deadly.
The whole silo, 120 meters long and 20 meters wide, turned into one single bomb.
An immense column of fire licks the sky, then falls in a heap of rubble engulfed in a fog of black smoke. The train carrying workers to the plant site is blown off the tracks. The massive concussion spreads over the BASF plant like rolling thunder, instantly turning factory buildings to rubble as it sets its sights on the village of Oppau. Children on their way to school and mothers at home are crushed by falling debris.
Ein schreckliches Bild muss ich in Oppau selbst.
There must have been a scene of horror in Oppau because there were many older style houses built in the old brick style. The pressure created by the blast was strong enough to push walls in, and in these houses, when one wall fell, it toppled the whole house.
Das ganze Haus zusammengefallen.
Maria Humpe gathers her children, certain that it must be an earthquake. She wishes her husband Herman was home to protect them. In nearby Ludwigshafen, the concussion shakes the home of Anna and August Dahmen to its foundation.
My mother was a child at that time, 5 months old, and was lying in her crib. And at the time of the explosion, a mirror fell off the wall, directly on top of her.
August Dahmen is a few kilometers away from the plant when the blast occurs, yet debris still strikes him, knocking him unconscious.
Mein Großvater gerade im Stall.
My grandfather was in the stable when the explosion occurred. He ran to the house to see what happened because the windows in the stable exploded, and so did the ones in the house.
Auf die Stallfenster eingeflogen sind. Und auch im Wohnhaus waren die Fenster gedrückt.
While surviving villagers move into open areas, fearful of another explosion, others scramble to find lost family members or to aid those crying for help under piles of broken brick and stone.
Dann war halt alles durcheinander. Keiner wusste, was passiert ist.
Everything was chaotic, and nobody knew what happened.
Dann sprangen die Leute.
Nobody knew where the shockwave came from, and all the townspeople ran into the streets.
Die Nachbarn kamen auch alle
The
raus.
neighbors came out and asked what happened, but nobody knew what was going on.
Keiner wusste halt, was los war.
Und die erste Aufgabe war natürlich die...
The first thing to do was, of course, to find the dead and rescue the injured. One also had to think quickly about where to put all of the injured and everyone that didn't have a house. That meant they had to look for emergency lodging. They quickly had to create lodging in schools and public buildings.
Sehr schnell Notunterkünfte eingerichtet.
Local volunteers and service personnel are aided by French troops who set up medical care centers and field kitchens to care for the hurt, the hungry, and the homeless. Many of the wounded have been blinded by the force of the explosion.
All the photos and all the eyewitness reports tell one masses of people moving up and down, more or less completely disoriented, traumatized, often bleeding, looking for their children who had been at school.
Unlike so many of his neighbors, factory foreman August Dahmen has survived. Injured and confused, all he can think of is the fate of his wife and infant daughter.
Zum Glück wurde nicht schwer.
Fortunately, he was not seriously injured by the explosion. But had he been inside the factory a few minutes earlier, he would have been dead.
Miraculously, August's family is also safe. His 5-month-old daughter, Anna-Marie, uninjured, despite having a mirror fall on top of her.
The mirror broke, but nothing happened to her, thankfully. I assume that because it was September, it wasn't very warm, and that she was well covered, and perhaps it was fortunate that she had a thick blanket on when the mirror fell down.
Dann erst hat sich langsam rumgesprochen, dass
Then slowly the news came to us that in Oppau, an explosion took place.
Oppau eine Explosion stattgefunden hat.
Entire blocks of houses had been ripped apart, trees uprooted, and railway lines bent and twisted.
Damage was enormous. All the 1,000 buildings of Oppau were damaged. About half of them were just flattened, or whole walls torn away. All the windows had gone, all the doors had gone. Most of the furniture in the rooms had just been hurled around, so there was not much left for most people.
Also ein Schlachtfeld.
It was like a battlefield with total destruction. In the pictures, you can see the people sitting in the streets with their household belongings and their children.
Bot sich natürlich
It was a picture of horror and devastation.
Das Werk selbst war im
The factory itself, in and around the explosion, was completely destroyed.
Dort, wo das Silo gestanden war,
Where the silo was, there was an enormous crater, a crater that measured 20 meters deep, 90 meters wide, and 125 meters long. It is quite visible from the pictures taken from the air, which makes it quite clear how horrible the explosion was.
The difference, for example, to air raids or to the results of a war is that it didn't happen in a night or didn't happen in several weeks or even months, but that it was really within seconds that the whole damage occurred. What human hands create in 1,000 years is flattened in seconds.
Wednesday, September 21st, 1921. In Oppau, Germany, a fierce explosion has ripped through the Badische Aniline Soda Fabrik fertilizer plant, sending a concussion of destruction and death into the surrounding area. In Heidelberg, 25 kilometers from Oppau, so many shop windows are shattered that glass fills streetcar lines, halting traffic for hours. Seismographs in Stuttgart, 150 kilometers to the south, register two distinct shocks a half-second apart. The sound of the explosion is even heard in Munich, more than 300 kilometers away. Bodies, many found up to 6 meters under the rubble, are laid in rows on factory grounds and in open fields. Their injuries are covered with straw, their faces hidden behind handkerchiefs. Family members walk the rows, searching for missing loved ones.
Or one pupil wrote in an essay that his brother was taken in, and of course they didn't recognize him because his head and his arm had been torn off and were never found. So they recognized him by his clothing.
Farmer Heinrich Portuna is able to identify the corpse of his 16-year-old son, Will, by the brand new shoes he wore to work that morning. While others are fortunate to survive, they must still deal with injury and death. There are so many casualties that medical facilities in the immediate area quickly become overtaxed, and the injured must be transported elsewhere.
The Oppau disaster is probably one of the first catastrophes in world history where motor cars played a larger role. BASF lorries, ambulances, even private motor cars moved into Oppau and tried to help with the transport of the injured people to the neighboring hospitals.
Katharina Henrich and her family watch the exodus of emergency vehicles pass by their farm near Mannheim. But they have an emergency of their own, also brought on by the explosion at Oppau.
Vor Schrecken.
My mother began to give birth to me because of the shock, and between 8:30 and 9 o'clock I was born. I was born not long after the explosion.
Also praktisch unmittelbar nach der Explosion.
But the miracle of birth is far from the minds of most families that terrible day. They want answers, anything that will tell them how something like this could happen.
Und am Tag des Unglücks und
Real chaos broke out in Ludwigshafen and Oppau.
Ludwigshafen, Oppau.
Family members of BASF employees stormed the BASF gates in order to find out whether their loved ones were injured or had had a fatal accident.
Zu erfahren, ob ihr Angehöriger verletzt oder tödlich verunglückt.
Thin lists of those missing were hung on the factory gates. It must have been a horrible day.
Ausgehängt worden und an den Bergtoren und dann, also das muss damals ganz schrecklich gewesen sein, dieser Tag. Als die Bevölkerung.
The crowd found out that someone named Humpa was employed as a blasting expert. And when they found out that this could only involve the BASF blaster and that he must be to blame, the people were very upset. And they went to Soda Street and threw rocks at the windows.
Die Bevölkerung hätte angeblich geschrien, lynch die Kinder und lynch die Familie.
The people apparently cried out, "Lynch the children and lynch the family." So my grandmother took the children up to the second floor and then barricaded the front door so the people could not get in. The worst moment must have been at that time, because now she knew she was alone with 8 children, and she knew in her heart that her husband would never come home again.
In the end, Herman Humpe is one of 561 killed by the explosion, including 177 BASF employees and 384 residents in Oppau and neighboring communities. Another 2,000 are injured, many critically. On September 25th, the dead are buried with a memorial service attended by German dignitaries and local residents alike. Many of those residents, some 7,500 in all, have been left homeless by the disaster. 75% of the houses in Oppau cannot be saved and must be rebuilt from the ground up.
Die Stadt Oppau hat das sogenannte Hilfswerk Oppau gegründet, eine Art Stiftung.
The city of Oppau created an agency to help the inhabitants of Oppau rebuild their houses or repair them, and various things like that. And the BASF contributed money to this agency, and they also paid the financial compensation for the widows or the children or the relatives of the dead.
Die Angehörigen der Toten, die Witwen oder Kinder oder Nachfahren entsprechend finanziell zu entschädigen.
Despite its willingness to provide compensation, BASF refuses to take responsibility for the disaster, stating that whatever caused the explosion was beyond the scientific knowledge of the time. A commission of inquiry agrees, unable to pinpoint the exact cause of the explosion or why it occurred after thousands of previous blasts had been completed without incident.
Alles, was man am Ende nur sagen konnte, ist, dass es im Grunde nur
The only thing that could be said after the investigation was that, for some reason, the chemical composition, as well as the physical properties of the fertilizer, the ammonium nitrate sulfate saltpeter, changed in the silo, so that the loosening blast resulted in an explosion.
sich geändert hatte in diesem Silo an diesem Tag, sodass es dann durch die Lockerungssprengung zur Explosion gekommen ist.
Whatever the cause, survivors of the Oppau explosion must put that terrible September morning behind them. But for many, it is a day they cannot forget.
I think, as my mother told us, that this greatly affected my grandfather. He suffered because of it, and there was naturally also his luck that nothing happened to him. It all affected him emotionally, and he was very struck and moved by it all.
Also in die Sodastraße zurück sind sie nicht mehr. Die haben sich eigentlich.
My grandmother and her children never returned to Soda Street. And so this whole situation resulted in this complete change of the family. But my mother told the story again and again, and all these things stayed deep inside us. And we also talked about them with our own children, so that the entire story always remained vivid for us.
Also dass das immer wieder die ganze Geschichte lebhaft geblieben ist.
The memory is particularly vivid for Paul Henrik too, but for a different reason.
Auch alle Leute, die da in dem Ort gewohnt haben, so.
Everyone who knew my parents and grandparents knew that I was the one born at the time of the Oppau disaster.
Im Lauf der Jahre.
As I got older, everyone knew who I was. And then they thought about the Oppau disaster.
The BASF fertilizer plant still stands near Oppau today. New technology introduced in the 1950s prevents the product from packing together in the silo, and blasting it apart is no longer necessary. 9 years after the Oppau disaster, a lack of knowledge about the effects of industry will once again bring tragedy to unsuspecting communities in a stretch of Belgian countryside known as the Meuse Valley. Monday morning, December 1st, 1930, A thick winter fog settles over northeastern Europe, blanketing parts of southern England and most of Belgium.
This was not unusual. I mean, in winter you have foggy days. But what was unusual was what happened in this small part of the Meuse Valley between Liège and Huy.
In 1930, Belgium's economy is heavily based in industry, and the heart of that industry beats in the Meuse River Valley. The narrowest stretch of the valley lies at Angers, between the towns of Liège and Huy, where the geography is a natural basin for low-lying fog. This part of the valley is home to 27 different factories, producing steel, zinc, glass, fertilizer, and explosives.
These factories brought a lot of commerce, but there were also a lot of small enterprises too, that provided livelihood to a lot of people.
The village of Angers is one of the larger industrial communities in the valley, nestled on the banks of the Meuse River.
It
was a quiet kind of city. There's an expression, happy people don't have histories. So there's nothing much written about Angers at that time.
On this particular December morning in Angers, 8-year-old Valère Bovy prepares for school in the house he shares with his widowed grandmother.
As usual, I had my cup of hot chocolate with buttered toast. And then my grandma saw me out to the doorstep and into a glorious sunny day. I can still remember that, son. I didn't suspect anything, and I didn't have the slightest hint of danger.
As Valère walks down into the valley to school, the bright sunny day begins to change. The air is heavy and still.
And as the road went down, the fog appeared and became thicker and thicker. I arrived to school, and in a class of 35 pupils, only 5 or 6 showed up.
Because of the poor turnout of students, the teacher decides to send everyone home early. There will be no class today. As teachers and students make their way home, the encroaching fog becomes more menacing. Weather conditions are colder than usual for this time of year, prompting residents in the valley to increase coal burning in their stoves at home. The smoke from home flues and industrial chimney stacks only adds to the haze.
We used coal for heat. We didn't have central heating except maybe in a few families, but it was very rare.
At the time, air pollution was not on the agenda as much as it is now, and there were hardly any anti-pollution measures. There were chimney stacks to prevent the smoke coming out really in your face, but there were no filters, hardly any regulations about air pollution.
Still, life goes on as usual for those who live in the Meuse Valley. Elizabeth Legrand has lived in Angers most of her life with no ill effects. Her son, Oscar Pirlet, is a member of the local police force.
I did not know my great-grandma, but let me say she was a very important person. She did not have any respiratory problems or anything else. She lived with my parents and my grandparents. At the time, it was custom to live with your family.
By Wednesday, December 3rd, the fog is particularly dense over the village of Angers, where residents can barely see a meter ahead. Young Louise Dams has lived in Angers all her 20 years, although that may soon change. With her whole life ahead of her, Louise looks forward to seeing the world beyond the narrow parameters of the Meuse Valley. Louise is used to foggy weather, but has never seen fog like that which entrenches itself over the Meuse Valley during the first 2 days of December 1930. Some area farmers, however, recall another unusual fog having deadly consequences for a valley not far from Meuse.
One of these episodes in 1911 had been quite bad, and some cattle had died from the fog. And because the farmers knew about that, when there was fog, they would take their animals to the hills above a certain height, and that would prevent their animals from dying.
In Angers, 7-year-old Andrian Lutz is amazed by what he sees, or doesn't see, outside.
I had gone downstairs and was looking out the window, but I couldn't see anything. Normally I saw the Meuse River because we live so close to it. We saw even less outside. There was a bad taste in the air, and my mother was also wondering, what's going on?
Andrian's father, Cornelius, works in one of the local factories and walks to and from the job site every day. But today, getting home is particularly difficult.
There were houses along the route, so he would follow the houses by feeling with his hands. And he did all of that by touch and feel for 2.5 hours.
Cornelius and others who go outside that day can attest that this is no ordinary fog. The air is pungent and clammy, and inside the vapor walls, it is difficult to breathe. By the afternoon of December 3rd, residents begin to show signs that something is wrong, not just in Angers, but also throughout the entire Meuse Valley.
The whole valley, people starting having complaints of sore throat, cough, feeling pain in the chest. And those who were prone to have asthma would have asthmatic symptoms, wheezing and feeling short of breath. And some people were getting very ill with fluid accumulating in the lungs because the lungs were being damaged.
Les premiers et les plus touchés. The people who were most sensitive to it were the people either more than 50 years old or people who had been exposed to gases during the war.
Even children are not immune, including those kept indoors.
Mother told us not to move, not to breathe too deeply. When she went out, she put a handkerchief on her mouth. The fog smelled bad, so we didn't do anything.
During the night of December 3rd, conditions continue to worsen. When an Angers farmer and his wife investigate sounds in their barn, they find their small herd of cows suffocating to death. Recalling similar circumstances in 1911, they do what they can to move surviving cattle to higher ground, despite being ill themselves. But the worst is still to come. By Thursday, December 4th, hospital wards in the valley are reminiscent of wartime dressing stations after a gas attack, as gasping residents are carried in by the dozens. Throughout the valley, terrified residents fortify themselves inside their homes, sealing windows and stuffing every crack with rags and paper to keep the fog out. Members of the local militia are sent to do what they can about the lingering fog.
Avec la troupe, avec les soldats,
the soldiers, they burned branches and firewood to try in vain to dispel the fog, which is exactly what they shouldn't have done. But they had no idea what the consequences would be. The smoke from the fires is quickly trapped by the fog, further polluting the air and making it difficult to breathe. In Angers, Elizabeth Legrand has been having trouble breathing since the night before. Doctors notice a bluish discoloration in her skin, often attributed to a lack of oxygen in the blood,
something they have seen in many other Angers residents. Yet the fog, even one as unusual as this, doesn't stop Louise Dams from getting together with friends. Later that night, as she disappears into the mist on her way home, she promises to see her friends again the next day. For many in the Meuse Valley, the next day will never come. Thursday, December 4th, 1930. The south of England is shrouded in dense fog, the worst in decades. Shipping has been suspended along the Thames River and in the English Channel. But many Britons are more concerned about the fog that hovers over neighboring Belgium. It is a heavy yellow fog, which lingers over the Meuse Valley in the heart of Belgium's industrial region. It seems thickest over the village of Angers, where many residents have taken sick. Even with medical care, some are not getting better, and there is little anyone can do. One of them is village matriarch Elizabeth Legrand.
The day after the fog came, the gas consumed her, and she died 2 days later. She was named on the official list of victims.
Oscar Pierlet is shaken by his mother's sudden death, but Elizabeth Legrand is not alone. 13 of her neighbors in Angers also die from their symptoms, and there are many more in other areas of the Meuse Valley.
There were about 60 people who died in a matter of a couple of days, where you would normally only have 6 deaths in this area. So there was a 10-fold increase of deaths.
So this heavy fog that takes your breath away is quickly baptized the killing fog.
Angers has been hit most in terms of the number of people who died, and the severity of the symptoms was probably worse in Angers than elsewhere.
But the severity of symptoms is not confined to those in hospitals. In Flamal, an elderly couple passes away in their own home. The elderly are hit the hardest. The average age of the victims is 62, the oldest 89. But the mysterious malady plays no favorites. The youngest victim is Louise Dams, who never makes it home.
The young woman who died was a 20-year-old girl who came back from a party, I believe, and who didn't come home and was found dead. It's possible that she was an asthmatic, but the circumstances are not very clear there.
Louise Dams is one of 63 Valley residents who die on December 3rd and 4th, 1930. The question that remains is how and why. That is exactly what authorities in Belgium and in neighboring countries want to know. Suddenly, the eyes of the world are on the Meuse Valley.
So there was a lot of commotion, and the press was alerted, and you had all sorts of alarming titles in the newspapers, not only in Belgium, but also in the international press. And people wondered what was going on.
On Friday, December 5th, 1930, the mysterious fog begins to lift, and with it, many of the symptoms suffered by Valley residents. Within days of the tragedy, a judicial inquiry is called.
A commission with doctors, specialists in weather, meteorologists, specialists in toxicology, poisoning. It had judicial power to interrogate people, to take samples, to perform autopsies, and to try and solve this mystery of the killing fog.
Investigators look to the obvious source, the 27 factories in the Meuse area, releasing from their chimneys some 30 different waste byproducts. Realizing that no single factory is to blame, the Commission is able to pinpoint an emission that comes not only from industry, but also from private homes.
So you had thousands of chimneys using the same coal that would be used in the factories. And when you burn coal that contains sulfur, you will produce sulfur dioxide. And sulfur dioxide can then, through a series of reactions, lead to the production of sulfuric acid. And both sulfur dioxide and sulfuric acid are very irritating for the airways and the lining of the airways.
Yet coal has been burned in the valley for decades with no lethal effect. The Commission concludes that in this case, the unusually dense fog, the abnormal absence of wind, and a process known as temperature inversion essentially turned the valley into an airtight container.
There is a sort of ceiling of warm air, and that prevents smoke from going up. And because it was a narrow valley, the pollutants could not escape, and they were just progressively accumulating in the valley. And all these pollutants then caused the symptoms and, in some cases, the deaths of the people.
For the first time, the tragedy of Meuse Valley provides irrefutable evidence of the damaging effects of air pollution.
Until the Meuse Valley disaster, nobody had ever found a convincing proof that urban air pollution could kill. And in this way, it's a landmark in the history of air pollution.
The Commission of Inquiry into the tragedy is also a landmark. The first time physicians, scientists, and meteorologists work together to explore the impact of air pollution. Yet it will be several decades before any real headway is made in anti-pollution legislation.
There were some changes in legislation, particularly in terms of permits to burn coal. What they also did was to make the height of the chimneys even higher than they were, because that would effectively prevent the accumulation of air pollutants.
Those that survive the killer fog of 1930 are left with the realization that they are the lucky ones.
I was very surprised that not one of my friends was hurt. We were all reunited after the fog. When it was over, and the young people didn't talk about it.
My sisters and my brothers, I don't know what they were thinking, but personally, I didn't understand what happened. But afterwards, many years later, when we began to talk about events that took place, it struck me that it could have been disastrous for our family.
The Meuse Valley fog and the Oppau explosion remain important examples of innovative dreams that turned into industrial nightmares. Today, the Meuse Valley fog is still remembered as a significant milestone by those who study the effects of commercial pollution.
I would say that the catastrophe of Angis, it will one day be in the dictionaries, one day in the encyclopedia. Because we need examples to tell us, this is what happened in the past.
BASF is still one of the largest chemical companies in Europe. Its fertilizer plant occupying the same site it did at the time of the explosion.
The memory of the explosion in 1921 is still very present, and also the extent of the destruction is deeply rooted in society today. And every year at the grave sites and the monuments, wreaths are laid down on the 21st of September to remember the explosion.
An dieses schreckliche Explosionsunglück zu erinnern.
On December 2nd, 2000, a bronze statue was erected in Angis to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Meuse Valley tragedy. It depicts the fog's youngest victim, 20-year-old Louise Dams. On a plaque below, the final sentence reads, "All human endeavors, even industrial ones, can be improved."
The little disasters happen like the big ones, but for the big ones, it's not by chance. And it's always the same. The saddest is for those who died, those who remain to tell the story.